The porch swing had been hanging empty for 3 years before Hester Brenner ever set foot in Laramie, Wyoming, and Ezekiel Calloway had built it for a woman he had not yet met, on a faith he had not yet earned, in a life he was still learning how to live. It was the spring of 1879, and the Wyoming Territory was neither tame nor forgiving. The land stretched itself out in great rolling waves of prairie grass and red clay earth, interrupted here and there by the jagged shoulders of mountains that did not apologize for being exactly what they were. Towns like Laramie were rough-hewn things, built from necessity rather than beauty, their wooden storefronts bleached by a sun that showed no mercy and their streets churned to mud with every decent rain. But there was something alive about this land, something that pulled at people even when it was breaking them, and Ezekiel Calloway had felt that pull deeply and without apology since the day he arrived. He was 28 years old when this story properly begins, broad across the shoulders the way men who work with their hands tend to become, with dark hair that curled just slightly at his temples when he had been out in the heat too long. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes the color of old amber glass, the kind that caught the afternoon light and held it there a moment longer than seemed entirely natural. He was not a man given to excessive talking, which the people of Laramie had initially mistaken for coldness and later came to understand was something closer to the opposite. He simply thought before he spoke, and he felt things deeply enough that he preferred not to make a mess of them with careless words. He had come to Wyoming from Missouri in 1874, following nothing more deliberate than the sense that the world ahead of him had to be larger than the world behind him. He had driven cattle, mended fences, worked as a hand on 3 different ranches before he had saved enough to file a claim on a modest piece of land about 4 miles outside of Laramie proper. The land itself was nothing to inspire poetry. It was flat in some places and inconveniently rocky in others, with a creek that ran reliably enough through the eastern edge of the property, and a stand of cottonwood trees that offered shade in the brutal afternoons of July and August. He had built his house by himself over the course of one summer and one autumn, the kind of solid, practical structure that spoke more of endurance than elegance, with thick walls and a good stone fireplace, and windows set deep enough that they gave the rooms inside a sense of being sheltered even when the wind came hard from the north. And then he had built the porch swing. He could never entirely explain why he built it when he did, before he had any reasonable expectation of someone to share it with. He had been sitting on the front steps one evening in the fall of 1876, watching the light go down behind the mountains in that extravagant way that only Wyoming light seemed capable of, all rose and copper and a kind of bruised violet that made the entire sky look like something you should not be allowed to look at directly. And the thought had come to him, plain and clear and almost unbidden, that a man ought to have someone to watch that with him, not standing, sitting, side by side. He had gone to the barn and started working that same night, by lantern light, because the thought had felt urgent in a way that he could not explain to himself, and would certainly never explain to anyone else. He used good cedar wood, the kind that smelled of something ancient and honest when you worked it, and he shaped the seat wide enough for 2 grown people to sit comfortably, and he hung the chains from the porch beam with enough weight in them that the swing moved slowly and not chaotically when pushed. He had done the whole thing in 3 evenings, and when it was finished, he had sat down in it alone and felt the particular silence of a thing that is waiting for something it does not yet have. For 3 years he had gone out to that porch in the evenings and sat in that swing by himself. Sometimes he brought a cup of coffee. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. He pushed himself back and forth with one boot against the porch board, and he watched the light change, and he wondered in that quiet, unhurried way of his whether the thing he had built would ever be used the way he had imagined it when he built it. He had never placed an advertisement for a wife. He had never asked any of the well-meaning women in town to introduce him to their cousins or their sisters. He was not a man who sought things out through channels that felt dishonest, And there was something about the idea of sending for a woman like you were ordering supplies from a catalog that sat wrong with him. He wanted things to happen the way they happened when they were real, and he was willing to wait for that, even if waiting sometimes felt like a kind of slow ache that he had learned to carry around without remarking on it. He did not know, on the morning that Hester Brenner's wagon rolled into Laramie with 2 broken wheel spokes, and a look on the driver's face that suggested he was reconsidering every decision he had ever made, that his waiting was about to be over in a way that would make all 3 years of it feel like a gift rather than a loss. Hester Brenner was 25 years old, and she had traveled from Columbus, Ohio, which placed her about as far from the Wyoming Territory as a person could get, while still remaining on American soil in terms of spirit, if not necessarily geography. She had come west because her father was dead, and her mother had remarried a man who was polite enough to her face, and cruel enough in small, invisible ways, that she had recognized the shape of the rest of her life under his roof, and decided with a clarity that surprised even herself that she would rather take her chances with the frontier. She had a small amount of money left to her by her father, enough to buy passage and supplies, but not enough to buy security of any lasting kind, and she had a letter in her coat pocket addressed to a woman named Adeline Marsh, who ran a boarding house in Laramie, and who had been recommended to Hester by a woman in Columbus who had a cousin in Wyoming who had once stayed there. She had copper-colored hair that she kept pinned up, but which was engaged in an ongoing campaign against the pins, sending curling tendrils down around her face and neck with what seemed like intention. Her eyes were a particular shade of green that shifted toward gray in shadow and toward something almost gold in direct sunlight, and they were the kind of eyes that saw things accurately, which is to say they were the eyes of a person who had learned early that seeing things clearly, even when they were unpleasant, was better than the alternative. She was not fragile. She was not the kind of woman who needed rescuing in the way that stories sometimes implied women needed rescuing. But she was tired in a way that went deeper than the physical exhaustion of the journey, the kind of tired that comes from spending years being small in a space that wanted you smaller still. And the Wyoming air, dusty and wild and smelling of sage and open distance, hit her when she stepped down from the wagon like a kind of permission. The driver, a taciturn man named Peters who had spoken fewer than 40 words over the entire journey, announced that he would need to see about the wheel before he went another mile, and he directed her toward the main street with a wave of his hand that suggested she would find what she needed there eventually. She stood for a moment in the middle of the road, her traveling bag in her hand, her hair immediately deciding it was done with the pins, and she looked at Laramie, Wyoming in the spring of 1879, and she thought, well, here I am. The boarding house run by Adeline Marsh was on the north end of the main street, a 2-story building that had been painted white at some point in the past and was now doing its best with what paint remained. Adeline Marsh herself was a woman of about 50, with the kind of face that had been genuinely pretty once, and was now something considerably more interesting, all strong lines and direct expression, and a pair of reading spectacles that she wore pushed up on top of her head, as though she had forgotten they were there. She received Hester's letter, read it in about 30 seconds, and then looked at Hester over the counter with the measuring look of a woman who had housed a great many people and developed accurate instincts about which of them were going to be trouble. "Columbus girl," she said, not as a question. "Yes, ma'am. You have a plan beyond arriving." "I have the beginning of one," Hester said, which was honest. Adeline seemed to find this satisfactory, or at least more satisfactory than the alternative of a plan that was entirely fictional. She gave Hester a room on the 2nd floor that had a window facing east and a quilt on the bed that had been made by somebody who cared about the thing they were making. And she told her that breakfast was at 6 and that supper was at 6, and that any business conducted in the rooms after 9 in the evening was her own concern, but she would prefer not to hear about it. Hester thanked her and closed the door and sat down on the edge of the bed and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2,000 miles. She slept deeply and woke to a morning that was all pale gold and birdsong, and she washed her face and pinned her hair with more optimism than the pins deserved, and went downstairs to figure out what came next. What came next, in the immediate sense, was a conversation at breakfast with a woman named Ruth Halliday, who worked at the dry goods store owned by her husband, and who informed Hester, with the helpful efficiency of someone who considered it their personal responsibility to match information with people who needed it, that the Laramie schoolhouse had been without a teacher for the past 3 months, since Mr. Finch had left for Denver without adequate notice, and that the school board was growing genuinely desperate. Hester had 2 years of teacher's college behind her, which was more education than anyone else in the room could claim on the subject. And by 9 o'clock that same morning, she was seated across from a round-faced man named Gerald Oates, who served as the chairman of the school board, and who hired her with the slightly panicked relief of a man who had been holding a problem without a solution for longer than was comfortable. The school was a single-room building at the edge of town with 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, a wood stove that worked adequately, and a collection of books that had clearly been assembled from donations rather than any kind of intentional curriculum. Hester looked at the books, and the space, and the fresh chalk she had been given, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as purpose. She had not felt it in a very long time, and its return was so sudden and so complete that it brought an involuntary sting to the backs of her eyes that she blinked away before it could embarrass her. She began teaching on the following Monday, and the children were exactly what children in frontier towns tended to be, which was to say simultaneously tougher and more tender than people who had not spent time with them would expect. They were not cruel. They were curious and occasionally wild, and they had been without consistent instruction long enough that there were significant gaps in what they knew. But they leaned toward her the way plants lean toward light, and within 2 weeks, she had established a routine that worked and a room that functioned, and the parents of Laramie had begun to regard her with the particular approval that communities reserve for the people who solve problems they had stopped believing would be solved. It was through one of these parents that she first heard Ezekiel Calloway's name. She had stayed late on a Thursday evening to organize the newer reading books that had arrived from the school board, and when she stepped out into the cooling air of the late spring evening, she found a horse tied to the post outside and a man sitting on the front step, hat in his hands, clearly waiting for someone. He was not Ezekiel. He was a man she would come to know as Donald Ferris, whose daughter Clara was in her class and who had come to speak with her about Clara's reading, which had been worrying him. Hester sat beside him on the step and they talked about Clara for a while, and then he said, the way people say things when they are moving from one subject to another without meaning to seem like they are doing it deliberately, that she ought to know that the man whose property bordered the schoolhouse land on the south side was a decent man, in case she had worried about it. Calloway, she asked, because she had seen the name on the fence post that marked the property line. Ezekiel Calloway, Donald confirmed. Keeps to himself mostly. Good man, though. Helped me move my cattle last spring when I had my back laid up. Didn't ask for anything in return. He paused. Bit lonesome, I think. Not the kind of man who would tell you so. Hester filed this information away with the particular attentiveness she gave to things that struck her as potentially significant without her being able to explain why, and she thanked Donald for his time and walked back to the boarding house through the blue evening air and thought about a name she had not yet attached to a face. She attached it to the face about 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when she had walked out to the school to retrieve a book she had left behind, and found a man mending the section of fence that marked the property line between the school's land and his. He was working with the focused economy of someone who has done physical work long enough that it no longer requires his full attention, which left a portion of his attention available for other things. And he looked up when he heard her footsteps on the dry grass, with the alertness of a man accustomed to paying attention to what happened around him. Their eyes met across about 15 feet of open space, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which might have been awkward but was instead something else, something that Hester would think about later and not quite find the right word for. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and level, the kind of voice that did not need to work to carry. "Good morning," she said. "Are you Mr. Calloway?" "Ezekiel," he said. "Ezekiel Calloway, you must be the new school teacher." Hester Brenner. She came a little closer because the distance had felt formal and she was not a particularly formal person. "Donal Ferris mentioned you." Something shifted slightly in his expression, though she could not have said precisely what it was. "Good things, I hope." "He said you helped him with his cattle when he was laid up. He seemed grateful." Ezekiel looked back at the fence post he was working on, like he was mildly embarrassed to have the thing mentioned. "It wasn't any great effort," he said. "I suspect it was," she said, "and I suspect you'd say that either way." He looked at her then with a directness that she noticed because it was not the appraising look she had grown accustomed to receiving from men who were trying to determine her worth according to some private scale, but something more like genuine attention, the kind that is offered rather than taken. He did not seem to know what to do with what she had said, so he did the thing she would come to learn he always did when something touched him unexpectedly, which was to become very still for a moment, and then redirect himself towards something practical. "Fence is getting a little loose on this section," he said. "I'll fix the whole run of it. You shouldn't have to worry about any of it from your side." "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." She retrieved her book and walked back toward town, and she was perhaps 100 yards away before she became aware that she was smiling, and she did not entirely know why, except that she had just spoken with a man who had looked at her like she was a real person and said nothing that was untrue, and apparently that was enough to make her smile in 1879 in Laramie, Wyoming, which probably said something about the quality of the conversation she had been having up to that point. Ezekiel finished the fence section after she left and then stood with his hands on the top rail for a while, looking at nothing in particular, and then he went home and sat in the porch swing by himself as he did every evening and watched the light go down. But the quality of the silence was different that evening, and he noticed the difference without remarking on it, which was his way. The next encounter was not accidental, though neither of them could have said they engineered it deliberately. He came to the school the following week because his neighbor's boy, a 12-year-old named Samuel Holt whose family lived between Ezekiel's property and town, had not been attending, and he had heard from the boy's mother that he was needed at home for work, but that she felt guilty about it. Ezekiel was not a man who inserted himself into other people's business as a general practice, but he had a soft spot for that particular boy, who reminded him of himself at the same age, and he thought the schoolteacher ought to know the situation so she didn't think Samuel was simply choosing not to come. He knocked at the schoolhouse door during the noon hour, when he had correctly assumed she would not be in the middle of a lesson, and she opened it with a piece of chalk still in her hand and flour on her apron from what turned out to be a lesson. She had been improvising about fractions using biscuit portions, which was the kind of creativity that comes from working with limited materials and a willingness to use what is available. She listened to him talk about Samuel with an attentiveness that he found, privately, remarkable, because she asked exactly the right questions and in the right order, and when he was finished, she said that she had already noticed his absence and had been wondering about the reason, and that she would speak with Mrs. Holt about the possibility of Samuel attending at least 3 days a week, which might be a compromise the family could manage. "That's a good idea," he said, meaning it. "Would you be willing to speak with her as well?" she asked. "She might hear it better from someone she already trusts than from me, since I'm new." He said he would, and he did, and within the week Samuel Holt was back in school 3 mornings a week, and the boy came home on the first day and told his mother that the new teacher was nothing like old Mr. Finch, and that he was glad to be back, which made his mother cry a little, though she did it privately. After that, the encounters became more regular, not because either of them was seeking the other out with any particular design, but because they were both people who showed up to the things they were responsible for, which meant they moved through some of the same spaces. And each time they occupied the same space, the conversation that followed was a little easier and a little longer and a little more like the conversations people have when they have begun to trust each other. He fixed other things around the schoolhouse that needed fixing, the window latch that had been stiff, the step that was starting to give, not because anyone asked him to, but because he noticed them on his way past, and it was not in his nature to notice a problem he could solve and walk past it. She began to leave a cup of coffee on the step for him when she knew he was coming, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had noticed he started work early, and the mornings were still cold enough that it made a difference. These small exchanges, these tiny acts of attention and care, accumulated over the weeks of May and into June with the quiet inevitability of water finding its way downhill. And the people of Laramie, who watched such things the way people in small communities always watch them, began to develop opinions about what they were seeing. Adeline Marsh mentioned to Ruth Halliday that she had noticed Mr. Calloway stopping by the schoolhouse with some regularity. Ruth Halliday told her husband, who told Donal Ferris, who mentioned it to his wife, who said she had thought something like that might happen from the day she had first seen Hester Brenner at the breakfast table, and noticed that she had the kind of face that a serious man might find he could not stop thinking about. The serious man in question was, in fact, finding exactly that. He had not been a man much given to distraction, but Hester Brenner had introduced a particular quality of distraction into his life that was entirely different from any he had previously experienced, which was to say, it did not feel like distraction at all, but instead felt like a sharpening, as though the world had become more precise and more present in some way he could not have explained without embarrassing himself. He thought about the things she said. He thought about the way she listened, which was entirely unlike the way most people listened, which was to say she was not waiting for you to finish so she could talk, but was actually receiving what you said and thinking about it before she responded. He thought about her hands, which were ink-stained from the chalk and the marking she did in the evenings, and about the way she looked out across the land, sometimes with an expression that was half wonder and half the particular hunger of someone who has been confined for a long time and is only now beginning to understand the size of the space they have been given. On the second Saturday in June, he met her at the general store, where she was engaged in a losing negotiation with a jar of honey that was priced at what she considered to be an unreasonable amount given the existence of other things she also needed to purchase. He overheard the negotiation from 2 shelves away, and he came around the corner and said, entirely without thinking it through first, that he had 2 hives on his property that were putting out more honey than he could use, and she was welcome to some if she wanted it, and the shopkeeper could keep his jar. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, which was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was the kind of laugh that was entirely genuine and slightly surprised, as though it had gotten out before she had decided to permit it. He found that he wanted to be responsible for that laugh again as frequently as possible, which was a discovery that he catalogued carefully and did not immediately act upon, because he was a man who thought before he moved. He brought her the honey the following afternoon, in a clay jar he had sealed himself, and when he arrived at the boarding house and Adeline Marsh led him to the small sitting room where Hester was marking student papers, the domestic ordinariness of the scene hit him somewhere in the chest with a force he had not anticipated. She was sitting in the late afternoon light with her hair coming down again, her green-gray eyes moving along the lines of a child's careful handwriting, and she looked up when he came in, and something in her expression shifted in a way that told him She was genuinely glad to see him, and the ache that had lived in him for 3 years rearranged itself into something that was almost its opposite. He stayed for an hour. They talked about things that were entirely unimportant and entirely the opposite of unimportant simultaneously. The way conversations go when two people are getting to know each other through the things that seem incidental. She told him about Ohio, about her father, about the teacher's college, without ever directly telling him about her stepfather, though he heard the shape of something difficult in the things she left out and did not push, because he understood that some things are told when the trust has been built to hold them. He told her about Missouri, about the cattle work, about the 3 years of building the ranch, and she listened the way she always listened, with her whole attention. And when he said, almost accidentally, that he had built most of the house himself, she said that she would like to see it sometime. He had not expected her to say that. He looked at her carefully to determine if it was politeness or if it was something real, and she met his look with a directness that told him it was real, and he said that he would like that too, and they both let that sit there between them for a moment without diminishing it with more words. He invited her properly a week later, on a Sunday, which was the day neither of them had obligations that could not be set aside. He arrived at the boarding house in the morning in his wagon, which he had done his best to make presentable, and she came out in a dress the color of new leaves with her hair pinned up more successfully than usual. And Adeline Marsh watched them drive away from her front window with an expression of profound satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal, since there was no one else in the room to conceal it from. The drive out to the property took about 40 minutes at a comfortable pace, and they filled those 40 minutes with the easy, ranging conversation of people who have discovered that they enjoy talking to each other, and are finding the range of possible subjects more extensive than they had initially supposed. She asked him about the land, about how he had chosen it, and he told her about the creek and the cottonwoods, and the way the light came down across the flat sections in the late afternoon and turned everything the color of old gold, and she listened with the quality of attention that made him want to keep telling her things. When the wagon came around the last bend in the track and the house came into view, she was quiet for a moment. He watched her take it in. It was not a grand house. It had never been intended to be grand, but it was solid and honest, and it sat on the land like it had grown there rather than been placed there, and she looked at it for a long moment with an expression that he found he could not read, and then she said quietly, "You built this." "Mostly," he said. "Some help from Donald Ferris with the roof." "It's beautiful," she said, and she said it the way people say things when they mean something beyond the literal, and he understood that she was not simply talking about the house. He showed her the barn and the hives and the creek, where the cottonwoods were coming into full summer leaf, and the water moved over its stones with the steady sound of something that had been doing what it was doing long before either of them arrived, and would continue long after. She took off her shoes and put her feet in the water, which made him smile, and she sat on the bank and tilted her face up to the sun with an expression of such uncomplicated pleasure that it seemed like something private he was privileged to witness. And then he showed her the porch. She saw the swing immediately, the way you see the thing in a room that is most itself, and she walked toward it with a kind of recognition that he did not know how to interpret. She ran her hand along the cedar wood of the seat, along the smooth chain, and then she sat down in it and looked out at the view the way he had always imagined someone sitting in it would look out at the view, and something completed itself in him so suddenly and so thoroughly that he had to hold the porch rail for a moment to keep it from showing on his face. "Did you build this too?" she asked. "About 3 years ago," he said. She looked at him with those eyes that saw things accurately. "Before you had anyone to sit in it with you," she said. It was not a question. He did not know how she knew it, but she did, and he found that he did not mind being known that way by her. He came and sat beside her in the swing, not close in a way that was presumptuous, but close in the way that made sense on a swing that had been built for two, and she did not move away. And they sat together and looked out at the land and the sky and the mountains in the distance, and the swing moved gently between them. And neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said yet, and they were both wise enough to know it. The summer progressed in the way that Wyoming summers do, with a ferocity of heat in July that broke in the evenings into something clear and cool and star-heavy that made you forgive the heat of the day. Hester settled further into Laramie, and Laramie settled further into its opinion of her, which was largely favorable, tempered only by the views of the 2 or 3 people in any small community who regard anyone new as a project of suspicion, until demonstrated otherwise. The children in her class made measurable progress, which she tracked with the careful attention of a woman who takes her work seriously, not because she has to, but because the work genuinely matters to her. And she wrote letters to the school board in the fall requesting additional books, and was given half of what she requested, which she took as a reasonable beginning. Ezekiel came to Sunday suppers at the boarding house with increasing regularity, which Adeline Marsh accommodated with an equanimity that was almost theatrical in its deliberate casualness. And he and Hester walked the town in the evenings sometimes, and sometimes she came out to the ranch on a Sunday, and the porch swing bore both their weights on these occasions without complaint, being a well-built thing. They talked on these evenings with the growing confidence of 2 people who have established enough mutual trust that the more important things can begin to surface without requiring courage. She told him about her stepfather on a Sunday evening in late July, sitting in the swing with the fireflies coming up from the grass and the first stars showing in the darkening east. She did not make a production of it. She told him the facts of it plainly, the small cruelties, the diminishing, the way a person can be reduced over time by someone who considers it their right to do the reducing, and the decision she had made that had brought her here. He listened without interrupting and without the kind of performing sympathy that is actually about the person performing it, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You were brave to leave." "I was scared," she said. "Those aren't the same thing," he said. "Being brave isn't being unafraid. It's being afraid and going anyway." She looked at him in the gathering dark and felt something in her chest open that she had kept carefully closed for quite some time, because it had been so long since anyone had said something to her that was true and kind simultaneously, and she had forgotten how large the space was that those 2 things together could make. He reached over and covered her hand with his, not a dramatic gesture, not a seizing, just a placement, deliberate and gentle, and she turned her hand over and held his. And they sat like that while the stars finished appearing and the fireflies moved through the grass below the porch. And neither of them needed to name what was happening, because it was already named in everything they had already said and done. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday evening in August, which was not at all the romantic day of the week that Tuesday is not, but which felt entirely correct because it was not planned and not performed. He had brought her some tomatoes from his kitchen garden, and she had been standing on the boarding house porch thanking him for them with a kind of earnest gratitude that she brought to all small things. And he had looked at her in the amber light of the evening and thought very clearly, in the way that simple true things are sometimes thought, that he was in love with her, and that the appropriate response to being in love with someone was to demonstrate it. And so he had leaned forward and kissed her very gently, and she had stayed very still for a moment, and then kissed him back. And the tomatoes had been set down on the porch railing with admirable care given the circumstances. When they separated, she looked at him with an expression that was simultaneously surprised and entirely unsurprised, as though some part of her had been expecting this for a while, but the part that lived in the world had not quite received the message. Her cheeks were flushed. His heart was doing something irregular and unhelpful. "I am in love with you," he said, because he did not believe in leaving important things ambiguous. "I want you to know that plainly." She breathed in slowly. "Ezekiel," she said, and then she seemed to discover that she needed a moment to assemble the rest, so he waited, because he was good at waiting and he would wait as long as this took. "I did not come to Wyoming looking for this," she said. "I came to make something of myself, to stand on my own ground." "I know that," he said, "but I find that I am in love with you as well," she continued, "which I would like to note happened without my permission or my planning, and I am still getting accustomed to the idea." He smiled, which was the slow, whole-face smile that he reserved for things that genuinely moved him. "I'm accustomed to waiting," he said. She reached out and put her hand flat against his chest, against the worn cotton of his shirt, and felt his heartbeat under her palm, and he covered her hand with his the way he had in the swing, and the evening around them was so perfectly itself, so precisely what it was, that it seemed almost irresponsible to ask anything more of it. August proceeded, and September came in behind it with the first intimations of the autumn that Wyoming took seriously as a season, and the relationship between Ezekiel Calloway and Hester Brenner became the kind of open and established fact that small communities absorb and then immediately begin to have opinions about, particularly in the direction of what ought to come next. Adeline Marsh had opinions. Ruth Halliday had opinions. Donald Ferris's wife Margaret had extremely specific opinions which she shared with her husband, who shared them with Ezekiel on a morning in mid-September when they were working together on a fence line, and Donald said, with the directness of a man who has been briefed on his position, that Margaret wanted to know when Ezekiel was going to make things proper with the schoolteacher. Ezekiel hammered a fence post for a moment in silence. "When it's the right time," he said. "Margaret says the right time was about 6 weeks ago," Donald reported faithfully. "Margaret may be right," Ezekiel allowed. He had been thinking about it, in the careful, unhurried way that he thought about everything important. He was not a man who acted from panic or from social pressure, but he was also not a man who confused patience with inaction, and he understood the difference between waiting for the right thing and merely waiting because it was comfortable. He knew what he wanted. He had known it for some time now with the kind of bone-deep certainty that does not require rehearsal or second-guessing. The question was only one of how. He did not kneel in the middle of the street. He did not make a public production of it, because Hester was not a woman who would have wanted that, and he paid attention to what she actually wanted rather than what convention suggested she should want. He asked her on a Saturday evening in late September, sitting in the porch swing on his ranch, which was where it had always felt most like they were both most entirely themselves. The evening was the color of the best evenings, all warmth going golden at the edges, and the cottonwood leaves were beginning to turn along the creek, and the whole land had that particular quality of fullness it gets in the last weeks before autumn takes it down to its bones. He had made her supper, which was not elaborate but was honest, and they had sat at the table in his kitchen and talked about everything and nothing, and afterward they had come out to the porch with their coffee cups and sat in the swing together, and after a while he said, without preamble because preamble was not his style, "I would like to marry you, Hester, if that is something you want." She was quiet in a way that was not alarming but was thoughtful. He waited. "What would that look like?" she asked. "A marriage to you, what would it actually look like?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "You'd keep teaching," he said, "if that's what you want. I wouldn't ask you to give that up. The ranch is mine and I'd work it, but there's no reason your work should be less real than mine. We'd live here. There's room enough, and I'd make it more if it wasn't. I'd want your opinions on the things that are both of ours to decide because that's how I believe it ought to work." He paused. "I'd want children eventually, if you'd want that too, but nothing I want should come at the cost of what you are." She had turned to look at him while he was speaking, and when he finished she was looking at him with those eyes that saw things truly, and she said, quietly, "I want that. Yes, I want to marry you." He exhaled slowly. She reached over and took his hand. The swing moved gently between them in the cool September air, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a bird made a single clear sound and was quiet, and the mountains in the far distance held the last light the way they always did, as though they were saving it. They were married in October, on a Saturday when the aspens had gone gold, and the sky was the absolute blue that only comes to the high plains in the full depth of autumn. The ceremony was held in the church on the main street of Laramie, a modest building that smelled of wood and candle wax and the accumulated prayers of the previous 4 years since it had been built. Hester wore a dress that Adeline Marsh had helped her make from fabric ordered special from Denver, an ivory wool that was practical for the season and beautiful in a way that was about the cut and the care rather than any lavishness of material. She carried wildflowers that were largely past their season, and mostly the tough, resilient varieties that held on into October, which suited her. Ezekiel stood at the front of the church in his good coat, the one he wore perhaps 3 times a year, and when she came down the short aisle on the arm of Gerald Oates, who had offered because there was no one else and it seemed wrong to walk alone, Ezekiel looked at her with an expression that every person in that church saw and remembered, the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his fortune and is not trying to conceal it. The minister was a man named Reverend Coles, who had been performing services in Laramie for 2 years, and who brought a genuine, if somewhat earnest, devotion to his work. He read the words he was supposed to read, and they said the words they were supposed to say. And when the moment came and Ezekiel slid the ring he had ordered from a jeweler in Cheyenne onto Hester's finger, a plain gold band that was exactly what she would have chosen if she had been asked, she held his hand in both of hers for a moment before she let it go, and the room was very quiet. Adeline Marsh cried. Ruth Halliday cried. Margaret Ferris cried and then denied it. Donal Ferris looked at the ceiling in the way men look at ceilings when they are managing their faces. Samuel Holt, who had insisted on attending despite his mother's uncertainty about whether it was appropriate for children, thought the whole thing was slightly incomprehensible, but that there was cake afterward which made it worth attending. They moved Hester's belongings out to the ranch the following week, and Adeline Marsh, who had known this was coming and had had time to prepare, was nonetheless briefly undone by the sight of the room empty, and then recovered herself and told Hester that she expected to see her in town regularly and that the coffee was always on. Living together had the particular reality of all things that have been anticipated, which is to say it was nothing like what either of them had imagined and entirely better. The rhythms of 2 people sharing a space require negotiation of both the stated and unstated variety, and they were both people who communicated honestly when it mattered, which smoothed many of the places that might otherwise have been rough. She brought her books, and they redistributed themselves through the house in a way that made the house feel inhabited in a different way. He made space for her in the practical arrangements of the kitchen and the workday without being asked, because he had thought about it in advance. She helped him with the accounting of the ranch operations, which he had never been as comfortable with as the physical work, and turned out to be considerably better at it than he had been, which he told her plainly, and without any of the discomfort that a different man might have felt. The porch swing became the place they ended their evenings, almost without deciding that it would be. They had supper and cleaned up together, and then they came out to the porch with whatever they were reading or thinking about or simply with nothing at all, and they sat in the swing that Ezekiel had built 3 years before he had anyone to sit beside him in it, and they pushed it gently back and forth with the ease of people who have found the correct place to be, and they watched the light go down and the stars come up over Wyoming. On these evenings they talked about many things. They talked about her students, who were progressing in ways that genuinely pleased her, and she talked about them with a specificity and a care that told him exactly what kind of teacher she was. They talked about the ranch, about what he wanted to develop in the spring, about the cattle and the additional acreage to the south that he was considering putting an offer on. They talked about the country they lived in, because Wyoming was a state still becoming itself, the territory having been granted women's suffrage a full 10 years before, in 1869, which was an extraordinary fact that Hester had found almost implausibly hopeful when she first learned of it. Wyoming women could vote, could serve on juries, could own property independently of their husbands, all of which existed against the backdrop of a frontier life that was simultaneously full of genuine freedom and genuine hardship, and the contradiction of it was something she thought about often. The injustice, too, was something she could not unsee. The land she and Ezekiel lived on had been lived on by people before them, the Arapaho and the Shoshone, and others who had been pushed from their territories by the same westward movement that had brought Ezekiel from Missouri and Hester from Ohio. She had read enough to know the shape of what had happened, and she did not permit herself the comfortable ignorance of pretending that the land they loved was uncomplicated in its history. She and Ezekiel talked about this too, on the porch in the evenings, honestly and without resolution, because there was no resolution available to two ordinary people who had not made the policies and could not unmake them but could at least refuse to be ignorant. And there was a kind of integrity in that acknowledgement even when it was insufficient. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a hard one, as Wyoming winters tend to be, the kind that arrives in October and does not release its grip until April, with weeks in January and February when the temperature dropped to places that made outdoor work dangerous, and the snow came sideways on a wind that seemed to have no geographical limit. They weathered it the way people weather hard winters when they are prepared for them and when they have each other, which is to say with effort and cold feet and a great deal of fire tending, and the particular intimacy that long winter evenings create between two people who have chosen to spend their lives together. She got pregnant in the late spring of 1880, which they discovered in May and which surprised neither of them in principle, though the actuality of it was startling in the way that all things which shift your understanding of the future are startling. Ezekiel received the news with a stillness that she had learned to read correctly, which was to say he was moved beyond his usual vocabulary and was containing it carefully. He came around the kitchen table to where she was sitting, and he crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his and said simply, "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm very well." He pressed her hands to his mouth for a moment. She put her hand on his hair. Outside the kitchen window the spring was happening with its usual lack of restraint, all green and wind and the creak audible from where they sat. She thought about the porch swing, about the empty space in it before she came, and she thought about how strange and full the world was, that it could be empty and then full again, and that the fullness could feel this specific and this right. She continued teaching through the summer and into the fall, reducing her days in September when the school board expressed polite concern about her condition, though she was not entirely in agreement with their concern, and said so with a directness that they were by now accustomed to receiving from her. She stepped back from teaching full-time in November with the intention of returning in the spring, and the school board hired a temporary teacher, a young man from Denver named Thomas Grady, who was adequate and who the children regarded with the mild contempt of students who have had something better and know it. The baby was born in December of 1880, on a night that was very cold and very clear, the stars outside the bedroom window extraordinary in the cold air. Ezekiel had ridden for the doctor well ahead of time, being a man who planned for contingencies, and the doctor arrived in good time, and the whole process, while neither brief nor gentle, proceeded without the complications that both of them had been privately afraid of without speaking about. The baby was a boy, solid and loud and immediately opinionated about his situation in the world, which both of them found enormously reassuring. They named him Thomas James Calloway, Thomas for the minister who had married them and James for Ezekiel's father, who had been a good man and was 2 years dead. Thomas James Calloway was placed in the cradle that Ezekiel had built during the last weeks of autumn, working by the light of the lamp in the evenings after supper, with the same patient care he brought to everything he built. He had made it from the same cedar as the porch swing, because he liked the smell of it, and because it seemed right that the things he made should be of a piece. When Hester first put the baby into the cradle, and it held him safe and secure, and did not creak or shift, she looked at her husband across the cradle, and felt the quality of feeling that does not have a commonly used word for it, which is the feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, with exactly the right person, in a life that is not perfect but is genuinely, specifically yours. The winter was navigated the way the previous winter had been navigated, with the addition of a small person who had strong opinions about the schedule, and who proved to be the kind of baby who became less distressed when he was placed near the sounds of ordinary life, the voices of his parents, the sounds of the house, the wind against the windows. He slept in the cradle in the main room during the days and woke frequently and nursed and grew in the way that healthy babies grow, with a determination that seemed almost deliberate. And by the time the spring came, he was smiling with an openness that made everyone who saw it feel they had personally accomplished something. Hester returned to teaching in the spring of 1881, bringing Thomas with her for the first months, which the students received with unbridled delight, and which turned out to be an educational asset in unexpected ways, since a small baby presents many opportunities for practical mathematics concerning weight and age and growth that are considerably more engaging than problems from a textbook. Thomas Grady returned gratefully to Denver. The students settled back into the comfortable rhythms they had established with Hester, and the schoolhouse resumed its place as one of the things about Laramie that functioned as it should. The year 1881 brought changes to the territory that were both practical and significant. The railroad connections that had been extending their reach through Wyoming were bringing both more settlers and more commerce, which changed the character of the towns they touched, Laramie included. More people meant more complexity, more business, more opinions about how things should be done and who should be doing them. Ezekiel put his offer on the southern acreage, and it was accepted, which nearly doubled the size of his land and required him to take on 2 ranch hands, men named Abe Whitmore and Crawford Reed, both of whom were capable workers and reasonable human beings with the ordinary assortment of virtues and flaws. Crawford was newly married himself, and had a wife named Lucy who became friendly with Hester in the easy way of people who have similar concerns and the good sense to be useful to each other. The community of the Calloway Ranch expanded in this way, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of relationships that form when people work and live in proximity, and are willing to extend basic goodwill to each other. Hester organized a small lending library for the children of the outlying families, borrowing books from her schoolhouse collection, and making a system for exchanging them that depended on the honor of the participants, and worked better than a more skeptical person might have predicted. Ezekiel, for his part, was the kind of man other men asked for help, and to whom he gave it, not from an eagerness to be needed but from a genuine belief that communities survive by mutual aid. By the summer of 1882, Thomas Calloway was a year and a half old and had acquired ambition that significantly exceeded his physical capabilities, which kept all parties in a state of alert attention. He had his father's amber eyes and his mother's copper hair, and his own particular determination that seemed to have come from the combination of both of them multiplied rather than divided. He was beginning to talk with an earnestness that was both charming and occasionally perplexing, since his pronunciation was his own invention and required translation from his parents, who had developed the fluency of people who have spent considerable time with a particular small person. Ezekiel took him out to the porch swing on the summer evenings sometimes, the boy on his lap, both of them facing the view that Ezekiel had been watching from that same swing for years now. Thomas would reach out for the chains with a focused curiosity and examine everything within his reach with the thoroughness of a natural scientist. Hester would come out and join them, and the swing would hold all 3 of them, though it required Thomas to be positioned between his parents with care, and it still moved with the same easy rhythm, and Ezekiel would look at his wife over the top of his son's copper head and feel the specific gratitude of a man who built a thing in faith and had the faith answered. In the fall of 1882, something happened that reminded them both that the frontier was not a settled thing, and that ease could not be assumed. There had been a dispute between two ranching families to the north of Laramie, the Haddon family and the Crenshaw family, over water rights along a shared creek, which had begun as a legal argument and deteriorated through a long, bad summer into something uglier. The sheriff, a competent man named Ellis Burke, had been managing the situation with effort and limited success, and in October the dispute flared badly enough that shots were exchanged on the Crenshaw property, and one of the Crenshaw hands was wounded. Nobody died, but the wound was serious, and the whole county sat up and paid attention in the way communities do when something has gone close enough to genuinely terrible to remind them of how near the edge of it they all live. Ezekiel was not involved in the dispute directly, but he was asked by Sheriff Burke to ride with a small group of men to serve as witnesses and peacekeepers during a negotiated meeting between the two families, because he was known to be trustworthy and because he had no stake in either side. He went because it was the right thing to do when asked by the right person for the right reason, and he came home the following evening with the news that the meeting had resulted in a water-sharing agreement that was genuinely equitable and that both families had signed, and that he thought it would hold. Hester had spent his absence with the particular quality of unease that comes from loving someone who moves through a world that contains real physical danger. And when he came through the door, she stood up from the table where she had been pretending to read and looked at him for a moment, and then closed the distance between them with 3 steps and put her arms around him. And he held her without saying anything because nothing needed to be said, only felt. "I don't like it when you go to those things," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said, "but I understand why you go." "I know that too," he said, and he held her more tightly for a moment. And Thomas, who had been asleep in his cradle across the room, chose this moment to wake up and announce himself with the vocal enthusiasm that had become his signature approach to consciousness, and they both exhaled into something that was very close to laughter and went to get their son. Life continued in this fashion, with its ordinary mix of the beautiful and the difficult, through the winter and into 1883. The school was growing, both in the number of students and in the resources available to it, and Hester had begun to correspond with other frontier teachers through a network that was developing slowly but meaningfully, sharing materials and methods in the way that people who are solving the same problem in different locations begin to solve it together. She had also, with Ezekiel's enthusiastic encouragement, begun writing to the territory's superintendent of education about the particular needs of rural schools, letters that were direct and specific and backed by the practical evidence of her own experience. And while the responses were not always what she hoped, they were responses, which was a beginning. In the spring of 1883, she became pregnant again, which they received this time with somewhat less of the first-time astonishment, and more of the particular joy of people who know what they are receiving. She was healthier in this pregnancy than the first, or perhaps simply less afraid of what she did not know, and the spring and summer progressed with the reasonable normalcy of a household that had found its rhythms. Thomas was approaching 3 years old and had opinions about everything, delivered with great confidence and occasional accuracy, and the days had the full, exhausting quality of days well used. The second baby came in November of 1883, a girl this time, smaller than Thomas had been but no less determined in her initial assessment of the world. They named her Clara Jane Calloway, Clara for the student who had first connected Hester to the community of Laramie, and Jane for Hester's mother, with whom she maintained a careful correspondence, and for whom she still held genuine tenderness despite the complication of what had come after her father's death. Clara Jane had her mother's eyes and her father's stillness, and she regarded the world from a very young age with a watchful quality that her parents found both endearing and slightly amusing. Thomas received his sister with the cautious curiosity of a nearly 3-year-old, who has been told a great deal about something and is now confronting the reality of it. He examined her in the basket with the thoroughness he brought to all new phenomena, and then announced that she was very small, which was accurate, and that her hair was the same as his, which was also accurate, and that she would need to wait until she was bigger to come outside, which was practical and showed a grasp of cause, an effect that his parents found encouraging. By Christmas of 1883, the Calloway household had achieved a particular fullness. The house that Ezekiel had built alone in the summer and autumn of 1874 contained his wife and 2 children, and the accumulated presents of all the years they had built together, and the cedar cradle had been moved from Thomas to Clara with the ease of things made to last. The porch swing still hung from its beam, and on the days that were not too cold they still sat in it, though now Thomas sometimes squeezed between them with his insistence, and Clara sometimes napped in her mother's arms while they sat, and the swing moved with all of it, patient and steady, built for exactly this wait. On one of the last good evenings of that year, when the cold had come but not yet fully committed, they put the children to bed and came out to the porch together and sat in the swing in their coats, the way they had that first autumn before they married, and Hester put her head on his shoulder the way she had long since stopped thinking about before doing, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the late December stars appear over the mountains. "I was thinking today," she said, "about the first time I sat in this swing." "So was I," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him with the particular expression she had for moments when she discovered they had been thinking the same thing. "What were you thinking about it?" "I was thinking about building it," he said. "About building it before there was anyone to sit in it with. I didn't know who it was for. I just knew it was for someone." She was quiet for a moment. "I think that's one of the most extraordinary things about you," she said, "that you built things for a future you couldn't see yet. That you had that kind of faith." He thought about this. "I don't know if I'd call it faith," he said. "It was more like hope, faith you have when you're certain of something. Hope is when you're not certain but you build the thing anyway." She considered this. "Either way," she said, "you built the thing." "I did," he said. She put her head back on his shoulder. The swing moved gently between them in the cold winter air, and the stars were very bright and very cold and very many, and the land around them was quiet with the held breath of a winter night, and somewhere in the house a child made a small sound in sleep and was quiet again. "Are you happy?" she asked. It was not a question she asked often, which gave it weight when she did. He did not answer immediately, which she had long since stopped interpreting as hesitation and recognized instead as the actual consideration the question deserved. He thought about Missouri and the cattle work, and the 3 years of building alone and the evenings in the swing by himself, with one boot against the porch board. He thought about the October afternoon she had come down the aisle of the church in ivory wool with a wildflower bouquet. He thought about Thomas's copper hair and Clara's watchful eyes, and the way the house sounded now, which was entirely different from the way it had sounded when it was only him. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said. "I want you to know that plainly." She smiled against his shoulder. It was the same kind of smile he had first heard on the evening in the general store, the kind that was entirely genuine and slightly surprised, as though it had gotten out before she had decided to permit it. "Good," she said. "So am I." The years that followed settled into the particular richness that comes to lives well built. The ranch expanded with careful intention. By 1885, Ezekiel had purchased the southern acreage he had long considered, and the operation had grown to a scale that required not just Crawford and Abe but 2 additional hands, men who came and went with the season and some who stayed. The land was worked honestly and it gave back honestly, and there were hard years and good years in the proportion that the land generally offers them, which is to say more good than hard if you are prepared and paying attention. Hester taught until 1886, and then made the decision, entirely her own, to step back from the full-time teaching to give more of herself to the children who were now 3 in number. Since a third Calloway had arrived in the spring of 1886, another boy they named William Henry, Will for short, who came into the world with the decisive energy of a person who has places to be, and wasted no time establishing his personality as entirely distinct from either of his siblings. Thomas was 6 and Clara was 2.5 when Will arrived, and the household achieved a volume and emotion that kept everyone occupied. She did not stop being a teacher because she left the schoolhouse. She organized a reading circle for the women of the outlying ranch families, meeting on Thursday afternoons on a rotating basis, which was the kind of community building that required no formal authority but accomplished more than many things that did. She continued her correspondence with the Territorial Superintendent of Education, and eventually, in 1887, was invited to contribute a practical report on rural school methods to a territorial educational conference in Cheyenne, which she attended with Thomas and Clara in tow because Ezekiel insisted they come and see the wider world, and because she agreed. The Cheyenne conference was a genuine surprise to her. She had expected to be a voice in a room full of louder voices, which was the experience she had been prepared by her history to anticipate. Instead, she found that the things she had learned and written were regarded with genuine respect by people who were working on the same problems from different positions, and that her particular combination of formal teacher's training and years of practical frontier experience was something that the room did not have in abundance. She came home from Cheyenne with 3 new professional correspondences, and the specific satisfaction of a person who has discovered that the work they have been doing in a small, local way is part of a larger and more meaningful effort. Ezekiel received this news with the pride of a man who had never for a single moment doubted that his wife was exactly as capable as she had always demonstrated herself to be, which is to say without surprise but with great pleasure, and he told her so in exactly those terms, which was the kind of straightforward, specific affirmation that she had come to understand was his particular form of tenderness. Thomas started school in the fall of 1887, which had the recursive quality of a child attending the school his mother had established and shaped, and which produced in Hester a feeling she could not have anticipated, seeing her son walk into that room and sit down at one of those desks. The teacher now was a young woman named Frances Poole, who had come from the East with her newly minted certificate and a willingness to be surprised by the frontier, and who had the good sense to ask Hester for guidance when she needed it and the better sense to take it when offered. The porch swing observed all of this from its post on the front of the Calloway house, bearing the weight of the years with the indifference of well-seasoned cedar and good chain. In the summers it held 3 children at once when they managed to agree on sharing it, which was not always, and in the evenings it held their parents as it always had, the rhythm of it unchanged, the view from it unchanged in its essential character, though the particular colors of it shifted with the seasons, and the hours with an endlessness that never became repetitive. Some things, made well and for the right purpose, simply hold. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, October of 1889, the children were in bed, and the night was the exact temperature of October in Wyoming, which is to say it required a coat but rewarded the wearing of one. Ezekiel had made the occasion with a supper he had worked on for the better part of the afternoon, which was not a thing he did often enough to be polished at it, but which was accomplished with the same focused care he brought to any task he took seriously, and the result had been good enough that Hester had told him it was good twice, which was how she expressed genuine enthusiasm about food. They had a glass of wine each, a civilized and somewhat unusual luxury that he had ordered from the store in Laramie specifically for the evening, and they had talked about the past 10 years in the way that people who have shared a decade begin to be able to talk about it, with the perspective of enough distance to see the shape of it. When they came out to the porch, it was fully dark, and the stars were doing what Wyoming stars do in October, which is to perform with an urgency that suggests they know the days are numbered. Hester sat in the swing and pulled her coat more tightly around herself, and Ezekiel sat beside her and put his arm around her, and the swing moved. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. Do you remember, she said, the first time we sat in this swing, the Sunday you showed me the house? I remember everything about that day, he said. She looked at him. His face in the starlight was the face she had been looking at for 10 years, and she still found it extraordinary. Not because it had not changed, it had. There were lines at the corners of his eyes now and gray appearing at his temples, but because the changes were not diminishments but accumulations, and she could see in his face the record of all the things they had lived through together. I knew that day, she said. Not in a way I would have admitted, but I knew. Knew what? He asked, though he likely knew the answer. That this was going to be my life, she said. Sitting in this swing with you, watching this view, she paused. I didn't know about Thomas and Clara and Will. I didn't know about any of the specifics, but I knew this. She meant the swing, the evening, the man beside her, the quality of being exactly where you are supposed to be. He pulled her closer. She leaned into him the way she had learned to lean into him, with her full weight, trusting the steadiness that had never failed her. I built this swing before I knew any of it, he said. Before I knew you existed. I know, she said. I think about that sometimes, he said. About what it means that a man can do a thing on faith before he has any reason to believe the faith will be answered. What do you think it means? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet, because this was a man whose thoughts arrived in their own time and were worth waiting for. I think it means that some things are true before they happen, he said at last. That you can know something is coming before you can name it. And if you build toward it instead of away from it, sometimes it comes. She considered this. The swing moved between them. Some of it is just luck, she said. The fact that I ended up in Laramie instead of somewhere else. The fact that your land borders the schoolhouse. Some of it is luck, he agreed. But some of it is the choices you make before you know what you're choosing for. I chose to build something that would last instead of something that would only serve me. I chose to wait for something real instead of settling for something convenient. Those were choices. He looked at her. You chose to leave Ohio. You chose to come west instead of staying small. Those were choices. And then we ran into each other, she said. And then we ran into each other, he said. She smiled, and he felt it against his shoulder, and the swing moved, and the stars went on doing what stars do, which is simply to be present in the dark and to be bright, which is perhaps enough. They sat out long past when the sensible time for sitting outside in October in Wyoming had passed, and neither of them suggested going in, because there are certain evenings that should not be shortened. The mountains in the distance were invisible in the dark, but they were there in the way that things which are always present are there, even when you cannot see them. The creek was audible somewhere to the east, the steady sound of it, and the cottonwoods stood in their dark shapes against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. Hester thought about the woman she had been in Columbus, Ohio, in 1879, sitting in a house that was trying to make her smaller. And she thought about the morning she had arrived in Laramie with the wagon and the broken wheel spokes, and the letter to Adeline Marsh and the fierce, uncertain hope of someone who has no particular plan beyond the determination to be bigger than the life that was being offered to them. She thought about the porch step she had sat on with Donal Ferris, hearing Ezekiel Calloway's name for the first time. She thought about the fence line and the cup of coffee and the honey in the clay jar, and the first time she had sat in this swing with the evening going golden and felt, without any logical reason to feel it so soon, that this was a place she could belong. She thought about the man beside her, who had built this swing before he ever had anyone to sit beside him on it, who had built his whole life with that same quality of patient, faithful preparation, clearing the ground and pouring the foundation before the roof was possible and before the rooms had their people, and then had waited without bitterness for the people to arrive. She did not know many men like that. She was not sure she had known any before him. "Ezekiel," she said. "Huh?" he said. "Thank you for building the swing." He laughed, which was the quiet, genuine laugh she loved, the one that happened before he could contain it. "You're welcome," he said. "I mean it the way you mean things when you mean more than one thing at once," she said. "Thank you for building it. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for building towards something you couldn't see yet." He was quiet for a moment. His arm tightened around her. "Thank you for being what I was building toward," he said simply. And there was nothing to add to that, and neither of them added anything. In the spring of 1890, Wyoming became a state, the 44th state of the Union, with full statehood that preserved the women's suffrage that had made it unusual among the territories, and that Hester had spoken and written about for years as the kind of thing that mattered practically, and not only symbolically. She was 36 years old, and she had lived in Wyoming for 11 years, and she stood outside the school with her students and a flag, and a great deal of noisy enthusiasm from everyone present. And she felt the particular emotion of a person who has come to love a place that has given them back more than they brought to it. Thomas Calloway was 9 years old and said that becoming a state seemed mostly the same as being a territory from where he was standing, but that his mother said it mattered, so he supposed it did. Clara was 6 and accepted this with the same attentive gravity she brought to most things. Will was 4 and was primarily interested in whether there would be additional food at the celebration, which there was. Ezekiel attended the town celebration and watched his wife speak to the crowd about what statehood meant for the women of Wyoming, and he stood with his hat in his hands and listened to her with the expression of a man who is proud of someone in a way that has nothing possessive in it, only admiration for a thing that is entirely itself and entirely right. The evening of Statehood Day they sat in the swing together after the children were in bed, and Wyoming was a state, and the mountains were unchanged by the designation, but the air felt different in the way that air feels different when something that matters has been made official. "Well," Hester said. "Well," he agreed. 44th state, she said, with women who vote. "As it should be," he said. She looked at him. "You have always thought so." "I have always thought so," he confirmed without drama, because it was simply true, and he had never been a man who found it difficult to believe that people were people. The years continued after that in the way that the years of a good life continue, which is to say with the steady accumulation of things worth having. Thomas grew into a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's quickness, who loved the land with the same deep, practiced love of someone for whom the land is not an abstraction but a daily reality, and who would eventually, much later, take over the management of the ranch with the competence of someone who had been prepared for it by example rather than instruction. Clara became a teacher, which surprised no one who knew her parents, and which she pursued with the same watchful intelligence she had brought to everything since infancy, eventually establishing a school on the north side of the county that was widely regarded as excellent. Will became a veterinarian, the profession discovering him rather than the reverse, after a childhood spent being the family member most interested in what was wrong with animals that were unwell, a calling that his parents encouraged with the characteristic straightforwardness of people who believe that children should become what they actually are rather than what is convenient. In the fall of 1892, Hester turned 38 and Ezekiel turned 41, and Clara had started school herself, and Thomas was 12 and Will was 6, and the house was full in all the ways it had become full over the years, and showed no signs of becoming less so. A neighbor to the west, an older widow named Mrs. Hartley, had come to rely on Hester for various kinds of practical assistance that the older woman accepted with more grace than she had initially offered it, and the friendship between them, developed over 3 years of practical proximity, was the kind that neither of them had anticipated but both of them valued. Ezekiel built a second swing that year, for the back porch, which faced the creek and the cottonwoods and was perhaps even better than the front in the long evenings of summer when the light came through the trees, and the water sounds carried up the gentle slope of the bank. He built it from the same cedar with the same care, and when he was finished Hester sat in it with him and looked at the creek and said that it was good. "Now we have two," she said. "Seemed wasteful to have a view like that and no place to sit in it," he said. She laughed. "Is that what you thought the first time about the front porch?" "Something like that," he said. "You thought there ought to be someone to sit in this view with me," she said. "Yes," he said. She took his hand. "Well," she said, "here I am." The swing moved between them in the cottonwood shade, and the creek moved below them over its stones, and the afternoon light came through the leaves in the shifting, dappled way of light through moving things, and it landed on them without preference, on the cedar of the swing and the gray in his hair, and the copper in hers and the hands they had threaded together in the easy way of people who have been doing this for a long time. And the day was entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary simultaneously, which is perhaps the description of all the best days. That evening they came around to the front porch at sunset, as they so often did, and they sat in the original swing, the one he had built before she existed in his life, the one they had first sat in together on a Sunday afternoon in the long-ago spring of 1879. The swing was 13 years old and showed no sign of failing, being a well-built thing made of cedar and good chain, and the particular intention of a man who built things to last. Thomas was inside with his siblings, nominally watching them, producing from within the house the particular sound of 3 children whose monitoring was being accomplished with varying degrees of dedication. The evening was settling in its long western way, taking its time with the colors in the sky, gold to rose to that bruised violet that had no proper name, and that Ezekiel had been watching from this porch for 19 years. Hester leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the swing found its rhythm, the same rhythm it had always had, back and forth, patient as the years, steady as the man who built it, as the woman who had finally come to sit in it beside him. "Tell me something," she said, the way she sometimes said when she wanted him to say a thing he might not otherwise say unprompted. He thought about it in the silence that she had learned to read as thought rather than reluctance. The sky turned rose. A meadowlark somewhere in the grass made its late-day sound. "I think about the evening I started building this," he said. "I was sitting on the steps. The light was doing what it's doing now. And the thought came to me that a man ought not to watch this alone, not standing, sitting, side by side. And you went and started that same night," she said, because she knew this part. "By lantern light," he said. "Because it felt necessary. I didn't know why then. I think I know why now." "Why?" she said. "Because some parts of your life know things before you do," he said. "Some part of me knew you were coming. Not who you were, not where from, but that something was coming that would make sense of the space beside me." He paused. "So I built the swing." She was quiet for a long time. The rose became violet. The first star appeared. "I am so glad you built it," she said. "So am I," he said. The star above the mountains was joined by a second and then a third, and the cottonwoods along the creek were darkening into their night shapes. And inside the house, one of the children said something, and another one responded, and there was a brief negotiation and then quiet. And the ordinary, extraordinary evening of their lives continued to give itself to them with the generosity of all things that are genuinely, specifically good. The porch swing held them in its cedar arms, and the chains that Ezekiel had hung 19 years ago from the beam of a porch on a ranch on the Wyoming high plains held them both. And the mountains held the last light as they always did, and the land held the night as it always did, and everything that had been built with patience and faith, and the specific hope of a man who builds toward a future he cannot see held. And it held, and it held, and it continued to hold.